Home. It's where you build your legacy, where traditions are started, seeds are planted, meals are shared, and stories are told. We are Chris and Natalie Carpenter, owners of Story Real Estate, and our team of top agents helps people find homes in Moscow, Idaho, and around the country.
Have you thought about a move? Contact us to get connected with a top agent who shares your values and puts your family first. Or reach out to us about our Moscow relocation guide.
Wherever you're looking to go, we can help you find home. Call us at Story Real Estate or visit us at storyrealestate.com and start building your legacy.
You sit in church week after week, embracing the truth of God's Word. You believe the gospel and claim Jesus Christ as your Lord. Yet you continue to struggle with pornography. You feel like a hypocrite, returning to the sin you hate that mocks the God you love. You desperately wonder, is lasting freedom even possible? Yes, you can overcome pornography, but not alone. 2 Timothy 2:22 says, "Now flee from youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart." Only by repeatedly running from sin to Christ with other believers can you hope to enjoy lasting freedom. You can live with purity and integrity. Take courage, seek accountability, and do whatever is necessary. Get equipped at accountable2you.com.
We're just going to start right there. Hey, y'all. Welcome to Cross Politic on the Fight Laugh Feast Network. It's good to be with you guys. I got an anti-white racist guy with me on the show today. Jeremy, we'll get to him in a minute. But first, God the Father is waiting and looking down the road for all his prodigal sons to return. Will prodigal America return to the Father in repentance, confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord, or will we fall on our own destruction and become a pillar of salt as a memorial for other nations? Ouch. Hope that doesn't happen. Join us on Reformation Weekend, October 31st through November 2nd in Fort Worth, Texas, for the annual Fight Laugh Feast Prodigal America Conference. You'll spend the weekend hearing from Dr. George Grant, Dusty Devers, Steve Dace, Dr. James White, Pastor Wilson, Pastor Toby. Of course, Cross Politic will be doing a live show. I still have another invitation I'm trying to finalize for you guys. He's a fantastic, well-known, well, I can't say anything because he might turn us down. Anyways, go to prodigalamerica.com, and we hope to see you guys in Fort Worth. Also, on to Jeremy. The prompter needs to move here for me. Jeremy Carl is a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, where his primary focus is on immigration, multiculturalism, and nationalism. Ooh, I just got some new questions for you in America. Jeremy, thanks for coming on Cross Politic, man.
Thanks so much. It's really fun to be here.
Yeah. So you wrote the book, The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. You wrote it. It came out like a year ago.
No, just actually a month and a half ago.
It was a month and a half ago?
So
okay.
We're very recent.
You were, how did I think it was a year ago? Because I was listening to an interview or something this morning. Anyway, okay, so it came out a month and a half ago, and it seems like it's just only picking up steam. That's where, when it came out, okay, a little splash, but it seems like it's really gaining momentum in this world right now.
Yeah, no, it's been great. We're on our third printing, which if you know,
are you really?
Yeah, so
already?
44 days in. So if you know about the publishing business, that's been great. I mean, even in the first week, I was fortunate. I did a big interview with Tucker Carlson.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I basically, I had a sales goal for the book for the first year, and I kind of hit that minimum goal my first week. So I think that's not important because, oh gosh, I want to go sell a bunch of books, but just indicative of, I think, the interest in this topic and
the conversation.
And the conversation and the fact that people want to have this conversation, but they don't necessarily know how to start and have it in a responsible way. Yeah. And that's what I've tried to kind of write this book to do.
Yeah. Because it seems like you have all the racism, it's a conversation that festers and it stinks. It doesn't smell good
right.
on both sides.
Yeah, of course.
You got the white boy summer thing over here and you got the George Floyd BLM thing over here. And, so how are you approaching this topic in a way you're actually making progress in the conversation and it's not a festering, stinky
deal.
Well, that was my hope. And I think what we did is I tried to kind of write, I mean, what I've told people is, even if you're the most online edgelordy type people, to use that type of terminology, like you will read my book and you'll learn some things that you did not know. But having said that, I did not write it with those people in mind as my core audience. I wanted it to be that you're just a normal person. Maybe you kind of sense that there's something not quite right going on in this world. But you don't know how to talk about it in the right way. Maybe even you're a little skeptical. I was like, is that really going on? You could pick this up and read it, and there's not a lot of like overwrought language. There's not a lot of kind of things. There are claims that I'm not backing up with citations and facts, and it'd be really comfortable. Or you could give it to your pastor. I've actually had a lot of folks who've given it to their pastors.
Interesting.
And not be worried that you're going to get something. This is like some crazy guy kind of ranting. So that was really a very, very conscious decision on my part in terms of how I wanted to write the book and for what audience.
So you had a different title that you were thinking about for this book.
Yeah.
Originally, that title was "It's Okay to Be White."
Right.
But then you changed it to what is now anti-white racism.
Yeah.
Why? Why did you? Well, first of all, what were you thinking? It's okay to be white.
Yeah. So the original, and I think it's actually in many ways it was unintentionally a wonderful illustration of the thesis of my book, in that. So It's Okay to Be White is a little bit of an online meme that had started at some point. But really the point was that so I'd kind of gotten this book title. I thought this would be a good book title. I had gotten that past the editorial staff, and as far as we knew, that was the book going forward. Everybody was excited about that. The sales staff came back and said, "We cannot sell a book with that title into Walmart and Costco." Like it wasn't.
Yeah, right.
But yet, like when you step back and think about it, at one level, you of course immediately you're laughing. You understand why. But yet, if I had this book title that says "It's okay to be black," or "It's okay to be Hispanic," or "It's okay to be Asian American," nobody would blink twice at a title like that.
Right.
And so I think it was very indicative of the kind of anti-white environment in which the establishment is operating. That if you say it's okay to be white, that is like, I might as well put on my KKK hood, right? But you could say all these other things with the exact same terminology and nobody would bat an eye.
Right.
So
what, you made me think of a couple things there. Have you read Aaron Renn's book, Life in a Negative World?
I've read some of it. I'm very familiar with
very familiar with the thought process that he's going down.
He's a good guy.
Is that kind of where we're at with this anti-white, we're kind of, being a Christian right now, we're in a negative world. It's not cool to be Christian. In same way, it's like it being white in this world is kind of a negative thing.
I mean, that's a fascinating observation, and nobody's made that to me yet. I think there's actually a lot to that.
Yeah.
There's a great parallel between the negative world, because in pre-1960s, we were in the positive world.
Right.
And by the way, positive world was not perfect in many, many ways, and I do talk about that. Right?
Yeah.
I'm actually less critical of, say, the Civil Rights Act than some of the people who, like Chris Rufo or...
now, obviously, you cite Chris Caldwell's book, significantly in the book,
and I cite his book significantly, but I don't go quite as far as them, because I'm very understanding as somebody who's been involved in politics. I mean, I served in the Trump administration in a senior role.
I knew there was a problem with you. I knew. I was like, something's going to come out in this interview.
There it goes. And so because I do that, I'm very conscious of like, this is not just an abstract intellectual debate we're having. It's a real debate about real people and real issues. And so I was very, very cognizant of that.
Yeah.
But, that was kind of the positive world in terms of whiteness. Like if you were white back in that era, like that was where you kind of wanted to be. Then I kind of grew up in the 80s and 90s in the sort of neutral world that Renn describes, where actually, I mean, I think things were kind of pretty good all around. And that's not to say that they were perfect in any stretch.
Def Leppard was great.
Def Leppard was great. Journey.
Yeah. Meatloaf. What else?
Striper.
Cranberries. The cranberries.
To hell with the devil, right? Like that was the world. So that was kind of the neutral world. And then I think around 2000, people have often asked me in interviews, was there kind of a switch point? I don't think there's one thing. I think there's a few things, but around 2000, I think things begin creeping more toward the negative world. And then right around the time of Obama's...
You think it's 2000? It felt like more like around 2008 where that really started.
Right. So it's like,
because Bush, compassionate conservatism was ruling the day.
Yeah. No, as I said, it's kind of gradual.
Sure.
Where you see a really big break, and this is not me just kind of making up stuff. This is like you go look at Pew Research's survey data on racial attitudes in America, are right around the time of Obama's second inauguration, 2013. You get what has been called by some, and you'll appreciate this as a Christian, the Great Awakening, which is a play, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners and viewers here know, on the Great Awakening, previous religious revivals that we had in the United States. But I think it's actually a wonderful term because so much of this anti-whiteness is really almost a religious thing as a substitute. Sure. I mean, this is a little bit like Vodi Bachum's critique of what he calls critical social justice in the church, where it really substitutes for Christianity in many ways. And so starting in 2013, things begin to get a lot worse.
Right.
And then George Floyd in 2020 turbocharges it. And that's kind of where we are now. We're backing off a little bit of the worst Floyd excesses, but it's still pretty bad.
So I wish Knox was here because I'd love to have him ask him this question too. The inverse could maybe be said about the black community.
Yeah.
Where it's like life in a negative world pre-1960s, right? You know, and then kind of neutral. And then, I mean, I wouldn't say it's all positive for the black community now. In fact, they're polarized. They're probably, I don't even think you could actually contextualize it as maybe it's life in a positive world for them now.
Right.
Because there's such a polarizing topic.
Right.
Still, but it doesn't seem like the negative life they lived in America is definitely not like it was, especially written in the laws, Jim Crow laws, all that stuff, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. But I do think kind of in general, the default kind of read in society now on blackness is a good thing. And I think you're right, of course, to contextualize that and say, well, but that's not always true. And there's obviously a lot of social pathologies and other things going on. But in terms of just how things are perceived, I think that this is more of a positive world, even though I think it has a lot of downsides for everybody the way we talk 100%. About it.
Yeah. Well, it's like, I remember you got this DEI stuff, you know, the hiring standards, all that stuff. So it's like, in some sense, being a minority is better than the hiring standards of a secular woke firm or whatever. Sure. But even, I remember Matt Chandler. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
He was doing this talk, maybe as a sermon, where he was working with this consulting company at his church, which is crazy, and trying to identify potential elders in his church.
Right.
And he was telling the story how the consulting firm came to him and said, okay, we have a black and white person. Let's say we have a black 7, white 8.
Yeah. The black 7.
And he's like, they asked Matt, who would you want to be put forward? He's like, well, I'll take the black 7.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then he went on to say, because that I don't want to be involved in any tokenism.
Yeah.
It's just like insanity.
Yeah. No, I go after a little bit. I don't do it too much because I'm not trying to divide. I mean, not that I would be in a position to divide the church on any of this.
I mean, you wrote this book. Come on, man.
But I talk a little bit about Acts 29 and the Gospel Coalition and some of these big EVA type folks. And I talked a lot with friends of mine like Megan Basham and about some of the stuff going on there.
So, yeah. Well, that's that would, I guess, be an example of where maybe it's life in a positive world for at least the black person at Matt Chandler's church.
Yeah.
But even then, like, I remember thinking about that and just thinking, I hope people would see this. But the next time Matt puts a black elder before the church, like, everyone has to be thinking, well, is he a black 9 or a black 6 or 7? Like, it's like he, in my mind, just destroyed the ability to actually put forward a legitimate elder who's happens to be black, and do that in a way where there's no doubt that he's the right guy for the job.
No, right. I mean, all this kind of flies in the face of the idea that we shouldn't be showing favoritism, within the churches.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it's really problematic. And it's actually interesting. So I read Vodi Bachum's book, Fault Lines, which I really recommend to your listeners and viewers. And I think he's really done, of all the people, the best job of really kind of breaking down how all of this stuff is not, it just simply can't coexist with the gospel. It is substituting or the gospel in every way. And even just at the most basic level where sin becomes a function of the color of your skin and can't be expiated through faith in Jesus, as opposed to we are all sinful and we gain redemption through our faith in Jesus Christ.
Amen. So actually, I want to ask a question that kind of goes down that path further. How do you respond to the critique that this issue, how is this unprotected? How's your book, anti-white racism connected to the gospel? Like what, it seems to me the initial title would be like, okay, you're just adding to the problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this was a difficult thing. I mean, writing this entire book was threading a needle in so many ways, because I didn't want to pull punches. And at the same time, I wasn't trying to inflame a situation. Yeah. I've said in a number of interviews, I'm not trying to create a new victim class here. I'm not trying to whine to the refs. I'm more trying to rally the troops to say, hey, we don't want this. This isn't something that works well for society. My simple view is like, if we don't address this problem and acknowledge what is going on right now, it's a problem for everybody, not just a problem for white people. Because if you look at the history, and I've done a lot of comparative politics in my own, if you look at the history of multiracial democracies, especially where you've had ethnic spoil systems at play, it's not a pretty history. And that is something we want to avoid. And by the way, that isn't to say, the Roman Empire kind of existed as a multicultural empire for quite a while. So it's not to say that you can't do it, but there's a lot of ways to fail. And I sort of saw us as going down, that kind of path to failure.
Okay, so let's just get to it. The heart of your thesis.
Right.
You're making a big claim here.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Anti-white racism's destroying America.
Yeah. Yeah.
Back that up in 10 words or less.
Okay, 10 words or less I can't
I'm just kidding.
But the biggest thing, literally what I do, this is why it takes, I've got almost 1,000 footnoted sources in the book.
Right.
So because I feel like when you write a book like this, you're not going to be given the benefit of the doubt, certainly by the establishment. And so I wanted to make it really, really clear that like everything I was writing was very, very buttoned up. So what I just attempt to do in the book is I start out with a kind of a discussion of where we are. I talk a little bit about the civil rights regime. You talked about Christopher Caldwell's book. Yep. And then I get into, on a chapter by chapter basis, everything from looking at schools to education to the church to entertainment to healthcare. And I just show, both through anecdotes but also through statistics, how kind of anti-whiteness has sort of invaded all of these areas of our society. I showed that this is like the common ideology that's behind them. I then kind of tie all of that together in kind of under a theoretical construct. I then talk about what we should do about it, and then kind of a way forward for all Americans, which is, because I'm not just writing this book for white people, I'm writing it for everybody. Right.
Okay, let me get into, because a lot of the problem I have with the discussion of racism is the definitions are all over the place, or it's a crappy definition.
Sure.
How are you defining anti-white racism?
Yeah, I think it's if you have a white person and that person is being penalized or punished in some way on the basis of their skin color. That's how I would do it. Now, there are, I guess, you asking that question, I should sort of back up and say the following thing. There's kind of two different things that are sometimes going on. First of all, you have formal racism and discrimination, where it's like, you're not eligible to apply for this job.
Or drink at this fountain or whatever.
Yeah. And you have informal stuff, like my chapter on Hollywood a lot. It's not that there actually have been some quotas in laws now, but it's more just like, here's the zeitgeist. Here is like an analysis of the way that, like, whether you have positive portrayals by race of characters over, 10,000 movies. So there's that. And then I'd say there's also two different types of things. There is things that are just targeting merit-based hiring and other things like that, in which white people get swept up. But you also have groups like Asian Americans frequently getting penalized for that. And I do talk about that in the book.
Well, the Harvard stuff was crazy.
Right. The Harvard stuff was the classic example of the affirmative action, right? And in fact, the plaintiffs on that were Asian American, although I think it's interesting because it actually shows you, again, in my mind, the kind of anti-white environment, because I think the very sophisticated lawyers who brought that case thought correctly that the conservative white justices would be more sympathetic to Asian American plaintiffs than they would be to white American plaintiffs. I think that was a very conscious decision on their part. I don't know that you'd ever be able to get them to admit that.
Yeah.
I think that was very much their thinking that it would be uncomfortable for them to do something that it looked like was
white favoritism.
Yeah, white favoritism. Like it was just kind of deeply against the DNA. But that is absolutely happening. And then you have,
which is crazy,
right?
Because it's like that you aren't really thinking like about justice.
No,
no. Justice is supposed to be blind.
But I mean, but if you've ever talked to good lawyers, you know that doesn't.
Right.
Right?
We know justice isn't blind.
Right. It's like, what do we need to do to have the right case to win this? So you have that, and then Asian Americans and some other groups get caught on this depending in the areas, and then you have some things that are directly being targeted at white people. So there are a bunch of different phenomena, and you just have to have a name for it. So that's what I've done.
Yeah. So you made me think of, can I get some water? Can we, Jeremy, get some waters? I'm dying here. It seems to me that the white towards black racism pre-1960s was, thinking of the black race as the inferior race kind of racism.
Right.
Okay? It seems to me that this kind of, white anti-racism that you're describing is more coming from a power play, envy. It's not coming from thinking of the white class as the inferior class,
right?
But more like, we're a grasp for power, which is what the Marxism thing is, right? And then maybe even envy,
right?
The white race has been successful, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a mix going on. I mean, I think that you do get some people who are. I mean, I start out my book with this quote from Susan Sontag, who's white herself, but she says the white race is the cancer of human history. So there is. She
wrote that?
She wrote that.
She was serious?
In serious, yeah. She wrote this in Partisan Review in like 50 years ago. So,
50 years ago?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, I'm just trying to showing how far back some of this goes.
Wow. Yeah.
But so I do think that there is actually some pretty negative, stuff, particularly when you get into academia, where people really do think, if you're white, you're basically the people who've destroyed everything.
Yeah.
I think underneath some of that is just what you said, though. There is a sense of envy or anger or, other things, other seven deadly sins that we try to avoid.
Right.
So I do think both come into play.
What do you think, given your thesis, what do you think was the cultural shift here? Where we talked a little bit like the negative world. We kind of broke it down that way, but like what happened?
Yeah,
that we're all of a sudden in this anti-white racist world.
So I don't think there's any one thing you can point to. I mean, if you want to trace it back a little bit, and this gets quickly theological, it's almost some of this becomes a weird offshoot of early 19th century Unitarianism, right? And like, why are you pegging it to some Unitarianism? Well, I mean, again, I like hesitate to get into it too.
Well, this is where I like to go. The theology side of things.
Right? Like this is where I'm like, oh my gosh, I just said that. Now I'm gonna get into.
You better man up,
right? But it's like no, I mean, like when you look at who were the original woke leftists in America, and it was kind of these liberal New England pastors who had kind of strayed from the Jonathan Edwards sinners in the hands of an angry God type tradition. And you begin, God is everywhere. And like, if you read these guys, a lot of it, I mean, obviously the referents have changed, but you begin to get a little bit of this kind of almost self-hatred, I feel like, going on, not in a kind of Christian way in which Jonathan Edwards would say you're all sinners and you should be very aware of that.
Right.
But like something that's a little more toxic. And so, but I think it spreads from there. And I think, secular Jews played a big role in the mid 20th century and kind of moving some of this along. And you had complicated things. I talk about immigration policy a lot, where you actually had, in terms of multicultural immigration, that was a Jewish and Catholic ethnics in the 1950s with a Catholic president really looking to do this. And then you get the Hart-Celler Bill of 1965. And that is the bill that dramatically transforms our immigration system in some very profound ways. And by the way, I think that changed demography.
Interesting.
Has a lot of why we're here today. And there's a great myth. I mean, this whole idea of a nation of immigrants is, you have to understand, that is it comes from John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. It had no historical valence before then. I actually walked through the real history of immigration in the United States before then, which of course I'm not saying we have not had immigration. Obviously, we've had lots of immigration, but just the actual history of immigration in the U.S. is filled with stops and starts. It was kind of all from one area. The Democrats have kind of tried to pretend that this is how it's always been, and that's actually not supported by the evidence at all.
And it's always a battle for definitions. It's always for that. So you defined anti-white racism. Part of the the black minority side of this is when I hear of racism, I'm like, give me examples. Let's talk about examples. Let's not talk about the generalization of what's going on, because then we have something we can deal with. Right. Okay, was it real racism or not? Well, we got to go through that. Just because I hired a white producer or whatever, it's like, am I being it's crazy, right? So give me some examples of what you're talking about with this anti-white racism.
Sure. Well, I mean, in the hiring and education process, you have very specific things, actually some of which are now being challenged because they probably are facially illegal under civil rights law, but we just haven't challenged them. And I think it tells you a lot about the environment that we haven't challenged them. Where it's like, if you're white, you can't apply for this. I mean, now it doesn't quite say it usually does the reverse. This is for, a BIPOC, woman or whatever, whatever else. So you have all those things going on. And, I could cite example after example, but I think, we're pretty aware of what that looks like.
Were you aware, or did you see the Smithsonian when they released this PDF or something about what it meant to have white privilege?
Yeah.
And one of them was like the Protestant work ethic.
Right.
Being married or something like,
it was really bad.
That was unbelievable. Is that the kind of, culture getting at, let's say, specifically as it relates to business and hiring practices, stuff like that?
Sure, absolutely. And then I think you have, I document things in healthcare where like people were given preference treatments based on race still going on, right?
Wow.
And the military. Again, my military chapter, there's all sorts of stuff. And actually, it's sort of interesting because the generals, who are really, frankly, being directed by the politicians, are trying to inject all of this like white privilege ideology and anti-white ideology. And
we've seen the PowerPoint slides, like from Navy or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the people blowing the whistle, and Tom Cotton, Senator Cotton, was one of the guys who kind of put a lot of this before Congress and was the source for some of this material. Are like people saying, I grew up in a third world country. I'm brown skinned. I'm looking at this white privilege military that you're talking about. I don't see that at all. Right. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. You're just trying to divide the troops, which of course we can't have. That's like the number one thing we don't want to have.
Is that division among the troops.
Right. So again, the book is sort of filled with various examples of what this looks like. In the chapter that I talk about real estate a little bit, we kind of have, and this is probably one of the most provocative things I say in the book, but I think I back it up pretty well. I argue that kind of what we call white flight was one of the only forms of ethnic cleansing in which the victims were blamed, and that I show pretty, I think, conclusively that it wasn't like white people just said, I don't want to live next to that person who has different color skin next to me, but that it became untenable for them because crime really went up, the schools collapsed. Again, not everywhere, but where you had white flight, it wasn't often random. People don't pick up and leave their communities, their churches, everything else.
Right.
Jack Posobiec at all.
Yeah, I know Jack.
So I went on Jack's show, and he's like very, very, very interested in this subject because this basically happened to his family, where they left this community, in his childhood that he'd had this deep like family affinity of for decades, because it just was no longer safe,
livable
physically. It was no longer a livable community. It wasn't because Jack's parents were like these horrible racists. Now, again, I'm oversimplifying slightly, right?
Sure.
I'm not saying, of course, there were racists who were, just going to move for various reasons, but there were real things that people were responding to, and yet that group has been really demonized in a lot of the public discussion of this, and they were arguably the biggest victims of it of all. They had to leave their communities because they were no longer safe anymore. So
it seems like we're really in this pendulum world right now.
Yeah.
There was real Jim Crow laws.
Yeah,
they were real.
absolutely.
It's crazy.
Right.
It's crazy to think and look back.
Yeah.
We did that.
Right.
And there's a lot of, obviously, we'd probably maybe connect some version of like white guilt to some of how we dealt with,
Absolutely.
1965 legislation, all that stuff.
Absolutely.
And then I would say probably white guilt's contributing to, this anti-white racism stuff.
Absolutely. No, white people are starring players in this. And again, you touch on the Jim Crow laws. And again, this is a reason why I don't beat up on the Civil Rights Act as much as some of my colleagues, because I'm like, there were real problems that were like, let's not pretend that we were in some racial idyll pre the Civil Rights Act. So I try to have, I don't do Monday morning quarterbacking. I try to have,
I love that. I'm so good at that.
yeah, I try to have sympathy. And
Sure.
One of my favorite historians, Gordon Wood, talks about like a great historian restores all of the possibilities for action that existed at a particular time so that you understand like what the motivations were. So I think the motivations were largely good. They were reacting to real problems. I think it was a very blunt instrument they used. And I think the relevant thing for us is to say we are as far away from that and the social problems of that time as those guys were from the Wright brothers time-wise. And we have a different set of...
And our planes are falling apart.
Yeah, we have exactly. We have a different set of issues that we're dealing with today. We're not worrying about people not being served at lunch counters. But we are worried about people saying effectively the equivalent of whites only, but like minorities only for some job or that
Well, but we're having the baked cake conversations.
Yeah,
so we're still having some countertop conversations.
Well, and I'm so glad that you mentioned this because this is a great Christian example of why I think we need to restore freedom of association in when we redo our civil rights laws in the private sphere, because it's absurd, right? Like the Masterpiece Cake Shop is the victim here. They are not the perpetrator.
That's right.
Like what we want people to do, these people could have gotten a cake anywhere. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
They knew what they were doing.
They knew exactly what they're doing. Right. Like we want people to be able to get cakes. We do. But we also don't want to penalize and say, we think that you might be discriminating against somebody. And so we've lost that whole concept of freedom of association. And this is where I do echo Caldwell, because I do think that these things do become incompatible, the Act of 64 and sort of the original constitutional freedoms that we have. But I say that even though I do have sympathy for like why we wound up in the place we wound up at.
Here'd be my take on that. Racism is a sin. That's what it is. Hatred in the heart of another color for whatever reason.
Correct.
Right? And it's amazing to me that back up for a second. And I'm sure, are you some sort of Presbyterian?
PCA.
PCA. So I grew up in the PCA.
Okay,
I was Dallas and PCA there, and I was actually PCA in New Mexico and in Oregon when I got there. The way God designed the world and how he called us to live, and when we organize society and cutting with his grain,
right?
All of a sudden you realize like, oh man, life's just much easier.
Yeah.
So when you look at racism as a sin, it's a sin. It's actually it's not a crime, and that's part of the problem of what we've run into here is we've dealt with sins like they're crimes, and given the government the authority to deal with that. Now it's a crime.
That's a great take, by the way. And
right.
I hadn't really quite thought of it in that way.
Yeah, I think that comes from Pastor Wilson, which I know you'll be.
Yeah.
So I can't. Gary DeMar, if you ever read Gary DeMar, God and Government, stuff like that. The being able to put these in the correct categories all of a sudden.
Right.
So that's why I would reject the 1965 legislation just because it's like the government shouldn't deal with sins.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, sin's horrible, but the problem is the government created the problem in the first place with Jim Crow laws.
Sure, of course.
And because again, the government shouldn't be dealing with societal problems,
right?
As at the sin level,
right?
At the crime level, government, God gave him the sword, all that stuff. Go for it,
sure.
And so so part of the pendulum in all this, I think, is coming from the fact that we constantly are trying to deal with sins as crimes.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things people talk about, I kind of talk about. I mean, I go through in my church chapter, I kind of beat up on the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians and all the people you'd expect. You'd expect them to all be horrible.
Yeah. Well, the Presbyterians are now bad about this.
Right.
I was in Florida. Sorry to interrupt you real quick. I was in Florida last week and met with a bunch of supporters of the show and club members and people who watch what we do. We got together at a brewery and three of them were all either at a PCA church or had left a PCA church because of DEI woke stuff going on in their PCA church.
Right.
And the one that was at the PCA church, he had a good liturgy. He liked it, but it was still like engaged culture guys. But the other two had left PCA churches over the whole woke DEI stuff.
Sure. Well, and we had, you may have seen, like David French was kind of invited.
Bro.
And then,
we interviewed him.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I should send you that interview.
I would be highly entertained.
Yeah.
But, I mean, and this is where I was like, okay, thankfully, thank God our denomination's a little healthier than that.
Yeah.
There was such an uprising among lay people.
It was crazy they invited him in the first place.
Yeah.
Like, who's the head of PCA right now? The Pope?
We don't have a Pope.
I know.
I don't know. I should know, but I just...
Oh, he was in Illinois. He was the pastor of his church in Illinois. Anyways, but like, what were you thinking inviting David French in the first place?
Right. Yeah. But I mean, thankfully there was a huge pushback.
Yeah.
They ended up canceling the entire thing, which was the correct call. But
instead, we'll pray.
But I said, right. So this is happening. I document in the evangelical church as well, and in even the more serious branches of the Catholic Church as well.
Yeah.
And what I say is, but you shouldn't be surprised about this because churches are filled with sinners, and
that's right.
Just we sinned on race in different ways 100 years in the past, and we will sin on race again. We will continue because that's just the nature of man as a fallen creature. But so we shouldn't be surprised to see this in the church.
Yeah.
What we just need to do is fight against it in the church.
But it's constantly been the cure has been far worse than the original disease. And that's why it's like going back to sins and crimes.
Yeah.
If the church would be addressing sins as a sin, you'd make a lot more headway.
Yeah.
But instead what they're doing is trying to address a problem in the church with like David French, who's going to make it worse, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's, we interviewed, I can't remember the guy's name, but he's pastor of, I think, Independent Presbyterian Church in Mississippi.
Okay.
And one of the, I don't think he quite knew the power of one of the stories that he told me on our show. He was talking about how he took over this church and they, in the 90s, and he'd been there pastor, I don't know how long, but he said, when I took over, everything was great. And we had looked back in our books in church and we had some sort of book of church order issue where they had required segregation in the church. and he said, and that was, and it'd been on our books for I don't know how long.
Yeah.
We obviously didn't practice it.
Yeah.
But what that told me, and he said, so we got off our books and everything, our book of church order or whatever, of worship for our church. But what that told me is this is kind of a lot what repentance looks like.
Right.
Is that as you grow as a church and deal with sins in church, there's things that you guys have done and put on the books that you just forget about, and then all of a sudden 50 years later you're like, oh, it's like abortion. This is how I could see abortion becoming this way in our land. Is repentance happens, and then everyone forgets because abortion they'd stop having abortions, right? We just stop killing babies,
right?
And then 50 years later we're like, oh my gosh, we still got abortion in our laws. Let's get rid of that, But I think that's like a kind of part of like this is what the gospel experience should look like in this conversation.
Absolutely. And I should say also in the church's defense that actually some of the first really integrated institutions in this country were actually sort of evangelical churches. I mean, some of them a little more out on the edges like Pentecostals, but that actually I think the evangelical church is not getting everything wrong here by any stretch. I'm not trying to suggest that they do, but it's just that we still have the same sins and problems and everything else that society does, and that shouldn't surprise us. So,
what do you hope that this book accomplishes? This issue is, like we said earlier, a stinking, festering, a porous sore. It keeps just. What do you hope to get is your book going to contribute to let's coming to some solutions here,
Yeah, well, and so I do, and what I want to do is to have an honest conversation about a difficult subject. I mean, that's why I wrote it. An honest and fair conversation, and one in which people don't think, oh, he's pulling punches, but they also don't think, oh, he's taking cheap shots. And I want that to be a multiracial conversation. And I actually said that very explicitly, that we are not going to I'm not going to do this. Like, if I just convince a bunch of white people that this is true, like, that's not actually going to solve the problem. There needs to be some level of agreement for everybody and for everybody in America. And so I suggest everything in the solutions from kind of getting control of our border to reforming civil rights laws to there's actually kind of an interesting concept. The more scholarly term would be ethnogenesis to use, but there's a guy named Eric Kaufman who's a multiracial scholar himself called white shift. This kind of notion that we kind of create a new American majority over time that is going to be of people of a variety of kind of strict ethnic or racial backgrounds, but who sort of identify with America's history and traditions. And right now, what you look at, and I document this a lot in the census, in other official government documents that we have, is we encourage everybody to identify as something other than white. We give them lots of advantages for doing that. And this is why you have an almost doubling since the 2010 census of the number of Native Americans. It isn't a Native American fertility explosion. There are lots of advantages to, if I'm half Hispanic by background, I'm going to call myself Hispanic because I'm going to get benefits from that. Yep. So if we had the government
call yourself Indian because you can get benefits from that.
Right. So let's have the government stop doing that, and then we could kind of use a lot of these people, many of whom have different racial backgrounds. I'm using that in quotes because we could get into race is both a biological and a socially constructed category. But you kind of develop a new American majority ethnicity that has people from a variety of backgrounds, but we're kind of united around that as opposed to all the squabbling we have right now.
United around what?
Around kind of a sense of American identity as belonging to all of us. That I mean,
cultural vision, similar cultural vision.
Yeah, I am a person. I have a variety of different. I'm not talking about me personally, but I have a variety of different ethnic antecedents, whatever else. I have a personal history. I really identify with George Washington and the founders, right? Like, it's just like that. I'm accepting that as my culture. The most extreme way that I know that, and I write about this a little bit in the book, that you could actually decouple race from culture in this way is the Hungarians, who, for a variety of reasons, they have a language and a culture that is deeply intertwined with the Central Asian invaders who came in 1,000 years ago and took over Hungary and eventually converted to Christianity, et cetera. When you look at Hungarian genetics, it's almost absent, that group. Because they all were running society and they were like wiped out by the Turks in the 14th century.
What do you mean absent?
So the genetic contribution of this group with whom the Hungarians feel huge cultural
it's gone.
affinity,
it's dissipated.
It's gone. It's not there. So they're kind of, their ethnic identity does not actually kind of correspond to any race kind of at all that's real, but they still have this culture that they're strongly identified with, right? So it shows to me how you can really, that's the most extreme level you could imagine. Where you can separate these things, and I think we should separate them as much as possible.
Okay, I'm sure the logical next question in this is: are you a Christian nationalist?
Particularly on this show and in this group, I would be very careful. I would say I've written things that are sympathetic to Christian nationalism. That's a matter of public record. Stephen Wolf has had me on his podcast. Yeah. He's been a big supporter of the book.
Yeah.
So I think what I would say, my mealy-mouthed answer, but it's actually also kind of an honest one, and I think it probably depends on the definition.
Yeah. Always.
I would like to see Christianity more in the public square in more aggressive ways. I've written a lot about this, like what I think was the abomination of the Supreme Court ruling starting in the mid-20th century that took out Christianity in places that it clearly was allowed to go. I'm not a fan of state churches per se, but I note, as you probably are well aware, that we had them until 1833. And so I think we are going to have a God at the center of American life. And I would actually like
which God is it?
God.
Basically, right.
Like,
is it the God of secularism or the Christian God?
Right. And so I would like to see within, I do think the Constitution puts some limits on this, but I think that I would like to see the Christian God rather than the God of secularism.
Yeah.
And I think we can do that in a consistent and constitutional way. And I would like to see us encourage Christian practice. So,
because ultimately in all this, like, we're talking about, what does a nation, how does a nation stay together?
Right.
How does a nation hold together over the long term, despite sin and things that happen?
Yeah.
Ultimately, you hold together because you have a similar vision and identity of what it means in that nation.
Right.
But even more foundational it's held together by Christ.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, ultimately, it's like Christianity is what's going to be the glue that keeps the health of the nation moving forward for the next 200 years.
Yeah, I agree. And again, because this book is not just written for Christians, I don't beat this into a dead horse or whatever. But I absolutely think that when you look at alternate things that could hold American identity together, rather than like trying to hit white people or any other group about race, like Christianity be kind of nice, right? Like, like why don't we try that, right? Like, am I allowed to say that? Yeah. So I mean, I think that can be a really significant portion. And I think, again, realistically, we have to say, just again, looking at our demographics, that's not going to apply for everybody yet. I mean, eventually it will, but
because we're post mill. Are you post mill? Are you on mill?
Yeah,
you're on mill.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what I'd say is that it can be, in the same way I was just talking about a majority ethnicity, it can be something that unifies a majority of Americans around it, and that would be a really good thing, right? Like, and I don't run away from that.
I had this. I was interviewed by NPR 9 months ago, something like that. And it was
braver man than me.
it was a Jewish man who was interviewing me.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the topic. We got on Christian nationalism, got very deep into the weeds of it. And I'm with you on kind of like, the term nationalism,
right.
Whatever. I mean, I'll take it, but I'll take the good stuff, not the bad stuff.
Right. Now you sound like a politician. I like it. Things that are good. I don't like things that are bad.
That's right.
Right.
And so he's going into practical stuff. He's like, would non-Christians be allowed to vote in the society? And I would say no. Right. Because you don't know how to love your neighbor well.
Right.
And so your vote would be crazy.
Right.
In the same way, it's like, it's still in the books in Texas where you have to be religious to run for office.
Right.
And by religious, they were talking about the Christian faith.
Right. Well, this was, the Supreme Court only outlawed that in Maryland in like 1960. And I can't remember the exact case offhand, but this was religious tests for office were, nobody thought they were unconstitutional. Yeah. Now, like whether they're wise and prudential in certain circumstances, you can have a debate about that, but they're not unconstitutional.
Yeah. And so he asked me, he's like, would a Jew be freer in a Christian nation?
Yeah.
And I said, yes. He's like, but I can't vote. I mean, you'll still be freer, buddy. Like, trust me. Like, we'd have no Department of Education. We'd have no Department of Labor. Like, we'd have no IRS. Just go down the list. Like, you would be way freer, have more money, and have more opportunity. Like, that's the freedom a Christian nation would provide all.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of blew his mind, because I'm, my ideal Christian nation, I would say, if you aren't a Christian, just you can't vote. That's part of being a responsible citizen. If you aren't a Christian, you can't run for office. That's my take. But regardless of what you think about the voting thing, in a Christian nation built on Christian principles, you wouldn't. Limited government was really a Christian principle.
Sure,
it was. Right, God defines what authority the government gets, not man.
Right,
and so all these, limited government, freedom of speech, all that is like based on Christian principles.
Right. Well, that's what Richard Dawkins is finding out too late, right? It's like he didn't understand until now, even though we were constantly telling him that he was a Christian atheist.
Yeah. Right.
Like he just didn't understand that.
Yeah.
Right? And these things all do come out of that. And of course,
you assume so much.
Yeah. You assume so much that is in fact. And so now he's like off calling himself a cultural Christian, which I think is great. And I'm not trying to discourage him.
You do you, boy. You do it.
Yeah. But this is progress, honestly. Like, the number of followers that guy has, and he's like saying, maybe there is something to this. That's a great first step that maybe some people will take more steps, and that's great.
And I think that's one of the beauties of like kind of COVID and where we're at now. Is you're starting to see what Christianity did bring to our country.
Yeah,
that even Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins are like, oh, I didn't see that before.
Yeah,
I didn't see that Christianity was actually bringing some sanity to our public dialogue.
Right. Yeah, so that's pretty good. I'm sure you blew the NPR guy's mind by. Because it's just like you can't even say that. I mean, you can say that here.
Yeah.
I mean, but.
Well, I was glad to say it there. I mean, I'm sure my words will get twisted and all that stuff, and it'll be a lot of fun. But it really is like if we're talking like true limited government, well, that's defined by God. Like I can't even play at that definition. Like like no authority is sovereign.
Right.
No authority is unlimited. That's a Protestant doctrine. It's I'm the head of my family. I'm not the unlimited head of my family. I'm not, God limits my authority as a husband, as a father. God limits the government's authority as a father and the church, So, all right. The unprotected class. Let me see here. How anti-white racism is tearing America apart, with author Jeremy Carl. Where do you want people to buy this book? Where's your favorite place to buy it?
Probably, I hate to say Amazon because it's just they're such a behemoth, but it does actually help in terms of rankings, and then more people see the book. So we're sort of stuck, like we're stuck without salvation immediately in America.
Amazon's killing us.
Yeah, but that's a great place. But if you can get it at your local bookstore, wherever, by all means do that. That's great, or some other online store. I don't care. It doesn't make me rich either way, but I do want people to buy it and read it and talk about it. And that's
right. Thank you so much for joining us on Cross Politic. I wish my guys could be here. Toby's out of town, and Knox is. This is a turnaround interview, so we're glad you could join us. So, if you're single, get married. If you're married, have kids. If you have kids, go baptize them. Until next week, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Go fight, laugh, and feast. This is Cross Politic.